Thank you for sticking around to the end of the conference for this. We hope we will make it worthwhile. My name is Doran Goldstein. I head the privacy data and cybersecurity practice at Catton. And on the securitization side of the world, I've also been involved over the years in a significant number of esoteric asset class securitizations, from pharma royalties to whole business to music and film licensing and related items. And really today we're going to talk about some of the issues that come with these esoteric asset classes, and as well as some standard asset classes with respect to personal information and securitization. I'm going to ask each of our panelists to give a 1-minute introduction to themselves, explain their background in identity, privacy, and securitization, and structured finance, and then we'll get back to our discussion. So, John?
Hello, I'm John Holohan. I'm a partner at Denton's, a large law firm. I run the consumer regulatory practice there, consumer finance regulatory practice, I should say. I'm on the board of directors. So I can tell you how miserable it is to run a large law firm. And I do a lot of, mostly large banks, private equity fund, Wall Street representation of my client base, and it's mostly around GLBA and the state privacy laws. And I started my career at Thatcher, Profit & Wood about 18 years ago, which was, a very heavy securitization law firm, and about 60 of us are still practicing together. So I see a lot of RMBS, particularly around resi mortgages, and deal with all those privacy issues. Was that under a minute?
Okay, I'm not timing. So close enough.
Hi, I'm Brett Shockley. I'm the CEO of a company called Journey.ai. My background has been in the tech industry for the last 30 years. I started and built 2 different software companies in the tech software area, in contact center specifically. I also ran both Avaya and Cisco's communication businesses in those areas. And started Journey a couple years ago, and what Journey's focused on is trusted identity. We came to the conclusion that the relationship between consumers and business was broken. And in a lot of respects, it was broken because we really needed to have verified identity as the root of trust in that relationship. And so we've spent the last couple of years building out a zero-knowledge identity network solution that can be leveraged in all kinds of different ways to support security, privacy, and do it in a way that doesn't destroy the customer experience. So that's what I'm up to.
Hi, my name's Emmy Sobieski, and I've been a technology analyst in the institutional space covering public equities for 25 years. And currently I'm an advisor for Leaf Global FinTech. And what Leaf does is when you have refugees that need to run, their only choices today is to leave their money behind or to run with their money and become a target. So Leaf allows them to take their mobile phone, download their bank balance, upload it into a Stellar blockchain, which is effectively a very, very secure network, run several countries, get admitted to the new country, get a new bank account, and then download their bank balance. We're currently live in 5 countries and Catalyst funded.
Austin Trombley. My background is about 5 years ago, I started a quantitative hedge fund. We were subsequently acquired by Franklin Templeton. So within Franklin, the fixed income group used to manage $380 billion. We just acquired Lake Mason, so that's about $700 billion. I lead the innovation within that team. And then I started a company called Token Vault, which tokenizes securities. And we just got SEC regulatory approval to tokenize a $20 billion money market fund, and that'll be our first one. We've got 1.5 trillion in assets now at Franklin, and we're going to be tokenizing all of that. And that's what I'm working on, yeah.
Great. Thanks. So today we're going to be addressing the inherent tension that I mentioned earlier between transparency and privacy. The greater need to understand the who of the underlying transactions versus the increasing societal expectations that the data that's collected is protected, is limited, and that disclosure is controlled. We have regulatory and investor requirements on more clarity and more understanding of the underlying data. But we also then have privacy and security laws, an increasing number of those that are pushing in the exact opposite direction. And some of the technologies we're going to talk about really are designed to try to address some of those concerns. By way of quick show of hands, how many people know what the GDPR is? I've heard about the GDPR. Okay, CCPA, and let's see, New York Shield Act, one less. Okay, so these are some of the laws that are now are in place that are really changing the way businesses work with respect to privacy. They're creating liability and creating a lot of challenges in terms of how personal data can be shared, can be transferred, and can be used by businesses. And there are more laws coming. I think this is one of the challenges, that the panel is really going to try to address in a couple of the comments, which is there's a lot more of this. So it's increasingly becoming global. Multiple countries, are enacting these laws. You then also have within the United States the likelihood, I think increasing likelihood, that the majority of states, if not all the states, are going to have their own privacy laws that are all a little bit different from each other. California with the CCPA, the California Consumer Privacy Act, is the first one to have done that, but Washington State is likely to do it in the next couple of months. It's already moving through committee, and multiple other states are doing it also. So really going back to now what we're trying to do with thinking about that basic data and trying to deal with it. And really, John, this is a question for you. What are the current tensions between issuers and underwriters versus investors in the RMBS market with respect to disclosures of loan level pool data?
Yeah, so, for RMBS post the credit crisis, which we've lived through for 10 years, there was a real demand on, and reasonably by investors to get as much possible information as they can about a loan pool or, when they're purchasing a bond in an RMBS deal. And they get a lot of that now from Bloomberg and other sources, but there is this tension, particularly with SEC, with the 15GA2 rule, where we now need to post diligence results, loan level diligence results, publicly for any rated transaction. So, we spend a ton of time talking about what's NPPI, what can we post, is there re-identification risk, is this de-identified data, do we feel comfortable about that? And that's primarily a GLBA issue, but then we have CCPA, which had a nice exemption for GLBA purposes, but it's not clear how that exemption really functions and how it should work. Look, I think for RMBS today, there is too much time spent on privacy concerns about consumer loan level data, and there's no quick solution for that. Perhaps technology will solve that, and blockchain and other things, but for now, we're struggling with kind of, square peg, round hole. Investors are demanding a lot of data, and here we are.
Great, thank you. And I think that brings us to sort of our next concept, which is there's a concept in security called zero trust, which essentially takes the pre-existing principles of information security, where you sort of had this castle and moat structure, whereas anything on the outside of your castle was a risk, anything inside your castle you assumed was secure, to a much more complicated method of security, where you don't trust anybody, where you assume that the Greeks have already put the Trojan horse in the city, and you don't know exactly who you can trust other than yourself. And so we're talking a little bit, and I'll throw this over, I think first to Austin to talk a little bit about zero security, and then the concept of zero knowledge that comes with that.
Yeah, sure. So especially in the blockchain industry, which was kind of born in the nefarious dark net, if you look at all the platforms that currently have been hacked and Bitcoin's been stolen in the digital asset space, over 90% of them are actually done by insiders. So the traditional security mechanism that's used, like the castle and moat, where you assume everybody internally is secure, that approach doesn't really work anymore. And so you really have to have a way to, without having any trust at all, to secure everything internally and externally. If you look at like BitThumb, for example, that was done by internal employees as well. They stole 13 million in Bitcoin. But there's countless examples of that. But the other thing in a zero-trust environment that's really nice with blockchain is that you can actually, and what's really nice, what I really like about the Stellar blockchain specifically, is that you get to decide which nodes that you trust and which ones you don't. So even in a decentralized fashion, if I want to say, this Stellar Foundation nodes that, are a foundation, it's a third party that is, doesn't profit from this. I only want to trust those nodes. You can define and dictate that when you build your cluster. If you want to trust thousands of nodes in Russia, you can do that too, but we don't. And so that's what another thing that's really, really nice about blockchain is that even in a zero trust environment, you can define who you do and don't trust.
And just very quickly, just for the audience, node and cluster?
Sure. So a node is, you could think of it as like a server somewhere. And that server, depending on which chain you're using, so like proof of work is kind of like a complex Sudoku problem that each node is trying to solve, and that consumes a lot of electricity. So there are a lot of ways to get consensus that are not as expensive and time-consuming as Bitcoin, for example. So Bitcoin takes about 30 minutes for 100 confirmations to happen. Ethereum takes 10 minutes. And so when you really think about the usage of a blockchain at a point-of-sale system, that it just doesn't work. Nobody's going to sit there for 10 minutes for a transaction to settle for a cheeseburger. Stellar blockchain isn't proof of work, and it's not proof of stake. It uses what's called Byzantine fault tolerance. And it's just, in my opinion, it's just as secure as proof of work, but transactions settle in 3 seconds. And the cost is, you can do about 15,716 transactions for a penny. And that's really, really cheap. So when you think about like Franklin Templeton, we have a transfer agency. Of the 8,000 employees that we have, 1,100 of them work in the transfer agency. It's it's prohibitively expensive for us to transact and actually write these transactions to a 30-year-old mainframe. And so I spent the last year kind of reverse engineering our transfer agency, and we've filed to become one with the SEC. And that should happen in like the next 4 or 5 months. But the idea is driving down the cost of actually transacting and changing the ownership of a security. Sorry, and then clusters are just, it's a network of many different servers that are distributed globally across many different regions.
So as the kind of the analyst in between this, what I found fascinating looking at the blockchain space was this idea that that you don't have to trust anyone, that it's trustless. And at the end of the day, I came to the conclusion that you have to trust the network. You have to trust that it's coming to the right consensus. And so you're just moving your trust, and was kind of fascinated when Brett brought up this idea of, instead of a zero trust or a trustless network like blockchain, what about zero knowledge?
So one of the concepts that we've been working on with identity is the idea of a zero-knowledge identity network. And the thought behind it is that in many cases, people don't actually need to know your name or your address or your credit card number. They need to know that you have a valid identity, that you're over 21, that you've got so much money in your bank account. They need to know that you've just completed a transaction that's going to send them money to pay for the item that you're going to buy. And it's sort of a whole different way of thinking about it. And so we built this distributed network approach to this, where there is no big data lake with a honeypot of information in the middle. Instead, you basically enter your information on your mobile device. It's encrypted locally, and it's sent across the zero-knowledge network to whatever the point is that's going to validate it or complete a transaction. It's unencrypted, that work is done, and then basically a certificate sent to whatever the endpoints are that need to know that it was valid, that it was proved, that a payment was made, but the actual information is never sent or stored, for example, to the business that you're interacting with. So, let's say, one example is, you call a bank on the telephone and an agent says, I need to validate your social security number. They don't actually have you speak it. They don't actually see it on their screen where they could copy it, steal it, whatever. Instead, they basically push a request to your phone, your form, you enter it on your phone, it's encrypted locally, it's sent to wherever it's going to get validated. It's unencrypted, validated, and only the certificate that it's true gets sent back to that agent's desktop, for example. So there's no information floating around to be stolen that's of any value.
And Emmy, picking up on that, so what is the role of identity sort of in the securitization process?
So it's really critical in terms of, at the end of the day, you need to know who's borrowing the money. And one of the concepts out there is, what do you know, or who are you? And the things that you know can be stolen, right? Like your mother's maiden name, things like that. But your irises, your facial ID is much, much more difficult, if not impossible, to be stolen. And so what you can get to with these next generation of security is a much more confidence about who that you really know who's borrowing the money. And when you know that on an individual basis, you can actually securitize far more revenue streams than just automobiles, houses. You can get to much more esoteric, and you can do them. You can do more of them, and at lower rates because the fraud level comes down.
Great, thanks. And I think, Austin, just a little bit in terms of what kind of impact things like that can have on ROI.
Yeah, sure. So the private credit markets are they stand to gain the most from this efficiency, I think. If you want to, even in the primary market, if you're buying a tranche of even Kroll-rated debt by retail borrowers, if you want to sell that as an asset in the primary market or in the secondary market, there's not only substantial brain damage associated with okay, I want to change the servicer. I'm going to buy this $30 million tranche of loans from Jefferies. And I want to change the servicer. And if you do that, you actually have to go back to you're buying a bag of loan IDs, and there's no PII or anything associated with it. So there's really hard to understand exactly what recourse you have. But that being said, you can go back to the originating platform and basically beg for the data of the asset that you own, which isn't ideal. And so in that scenario, if you could encrypt all of the PII and sell it with the asset, and then the person with the private key is the only one that can unlock that, that is a much more ideal way of selling and buying an asset, knowing exactly what you're getting and being able to substantiate that these are real humans with real credit scores behind them. And if it's on chain, it becomes an artifact in history. So a good example is when with that $30 million tranche of Jefferies loans that they bought from a platform I won't name. It's in the news, so you can see it if you Google it. But they bought $30 million, and they said, I don't want any subprime debt in this, none. Well, the platform lied, and they put in a lot of subprime. And when that tranche of debt didn't perform, they looked under the hood, and they did some studies, but the platform was able to lie about the credit worthiness of the people of the loans that they had securitized. And if that had been on chain at the point of origination on a public distributed ledger as an artifact in history, I could go back in time and be like, whoa, 20% of this is crap and shouldn't be in here. But that's not how it's done currently. And so I think that there's a huge amount of liquidity that would unlock, and the efficiency of trading that as an asset stands to gain a lot.
Yeah, so respectfully from my experience, there's a lot of loan level data that's shared for a bond investor. It's probably more fulsome than it's ever been. And GLBA and the requisite state privacy laws have broad exemption for sharing when you're selling or securitizing loans. And so I would just say that Blockchain has a ton of solutions for this market, and it's, whatever it is, 18 trillion in just resi mortgages in the U.S. alone. When you count derivatives, it's perhaps the biggest financial market in the world. But I do think investors get a heck of a lot of information today. It's just about making it, in my mind, it's just about making it easier to get and quicker to get it without the brain damage. But I do think investors generally know, specifically in RMBS deals, I mean, we're talking about underwriting exceptions. They know everything about how those loans are and how they were originated. And so I do think it's a pretty transparent market at the loan level.
How is CCPA and GDPR going to affect that information flowing between all those different parties?
CCPA has a broad exemption for when you're sharing for GLBA purposes, which was quite helpful for resi mortgages in particular. What it means, though, is not clear, because if you make a business purpose loan, like the SFR market, single-family rental, when you originate a business purpose loan, that's not really subject to GLBA. So then do we have to share, do we have to comply with CCPA for our business purpose originations, or can we just assume that generally we're lending and can?
But if you're a consumer, and we've got things like CCPA coming in to protect consumers' identity and sort of the promiscuous way that we tend to throw identity around in today's world, where it gets stolen or hacked, or every week we hear about 100 million identities being stolen.
Yep.
Getting an exemption might be good for business flow right now, but in the long run, it's an issue if you use sort of today's technology to let that information be made available to lots of different parties, right? So I mean, there's a tension there, right?
I don't disagree with that.
Yeah.
There's absolutely a tension. That's fair.
Yeah.
And I think, and this I think I'm going to throw over to everybody, because I think there is that obvious tension between the legal exemptions and just falling within the legal framework that allows sharing of data, and then the related security issue that we have to talk about. Because one of the important things about CCPA, but about other ones, is the security exemptions don't exist. So yes, you can share the data, but you're still liable for what happens to that data. And so the question, I think, for everybody is, how do you see some of these technologies, and I think, Brett, a lot of your commentary was helpful in that, dealing with both the security requirements that all of these laws have and addressing that. And then secondly, most of these laws have exemptions or carve out from the definition of what is personal information that can't be re-identified back. So either they use different terms, anonymous, de-identified, et cetera. How do you see these technologies work? And I think I'll just throw this over to the technology folks on this.
Do you want to start?
Sure. I mean, to me, I think you have to go back to the beginning of the process, and I like to think about it starting with onboarding through legally compliant KYC to the verified interactions you're going to have with the loan issuer, for example, to then what happens from there in terms of how do you move that customer data around in a privacy-preserving way that still meets the obligations so that you can rate the loan portfolio, for example. And ultimately, you get to some place further down the path where you might want to be able to verify that customer data. And so there's an approach that I think we have to take where we sort of start with basically giving the customer some confidence that if they're transparent in what they provide, that's going to get them better rates on their loans because they're giving better information, and this process is going to flow with less friction. But along with that, you have to give them the confidence that the way I'm providing this information, it's not going to end up in 72 databases spread around the world and get hacked and, all the issues that we read about in the news every day. So I think that's one of the technological challenges that we're all kind of working on and paying attention to is let's approach this with the concept that we're going to be very transparent in the information that we're going to get. We're going to store it in a way that's not in some big data lake someplace that's easy, not easy, but that a hacker's going to be attracted to go and hack. And one of the ways that we're approaching that is to keep the information distributed, the source information originally, then the keys to that information in sort of a distributed approach. The information is set up in such a way using new cryptography techniques where it can be reconstituted, unencrypted, and delivered to the destinations that have been legally agreed to at the time that the information was collected. It's something called proxy re-encryption. So that allows you to basically go from the origination of the loan and the onboarding, let's say, to somebody that might end up with that loan in a portfolio later on. That authority to be able to unencrypt and read it under certain circumstances can be passed through that whole chain without any of the intermediaries being able to actually read the information. So there's a lot of new techniques that we're applying to be able to do that sort of thing, and we think it both improves the transparency dramatically. It should drive down the costs and the friction associated in the whole securitization process, because we're not guessing at some of these things like we have to today. And at the end, if you need to basically deal with the situation Austin talked about where somebody hasn't sort of played fairly, it's easier to go back and conclusively prove that.
So,
I think another really good use case too is we do accreditation on our platform, and it's not in our best interest to collect all your bank statements and store that information. It's not yours either. In a zero knowledge build out, basically a company like Journey can, we can get a third party attestation that they are accredited, and without us having to store or even see the information. And that's better for the consumer, and it's better for the companies, because now we don't store sensitive information that can be hacked and stolen.
and so specific to privacy, and just as a historical perspective, looking at technology over time, one of the things that I see is a lot of times a company will come out with something revolutionary instead of evolutionary, and it won't be so much better that everybody's going to want to shift to it. And so the evolutionary ones tend to be the better solutions over time until they're not. And so if you think about right now with GDPR and California privacy, the solutions that I've seen that are really cutting edge are, you get this huge data warehouse, you have data scientists that know Python, and then they know Spark, and then they use Databricks, and they get this Delta Lake. And then when someone requests to know where their data is and to remove it, they can actually get it done within the time frame that the regulation requires. And so there's actually just not enough data scientists to do that. And so then you kind of run into this ceiling, and you need something that is a whole new way of looking at the situation, rather than just kind of chasing your tail and trying to work with these huge databases.
Okay. And actually, sort of with respect to that, you know, what you talked about earlier about Global Leaf and that process, I think that can provide some examples for us also, the idea of just making your personal file that transportable.
Yeah.
Can you give us some examples, some of the challenges and some of the successes?
Yeah, absolutely. So one of the interesting, and Stellar, and we do, Leaf Global FinTech uses a Stellar blockchain. One of the I guess I would say two challenges. If you think about a refugee that's on the run from the Congo that's trying to get into Rwanda, that person likely does not have an iPhone. And so they needed to go down to basically 2G mobile money and have all of this still work with cutting edge technology. So that was a technological challenge, and it has been solved successfully because they're live in 5 countries. So the bigger challenge was that when you talk about blockchain with this whole era of ICOs, and you're talking about banks, and you're in countries, you have to actually go to effectively the Federal Reserve of each one of those countries, get approved by the Federal Reserve, and then approved by those banks. And the Federal Reserve is saying, we don't want our poorest, most vulnerable citizens basically speculating on cryptocurrencies. And so, and they weren't, but it took a long time to educate that we are just using the technology, and that it's actually backed by, it's backed by a very stable fiat. So we're not speculating in cryptocurrency. So that took a while. And I think the biggest success for us is just traction. right? There's been a lot of projects out there that say they're going to do all this great thing, and we actually have refugees and refugee camps, and they're testing out, and we're live in 5 countries. So I think that's really exciting. And the second thing is we've actually had interest from Colombia, who is also having refugees coming into Colombia, and so there's actually interest to expand to South America, which we have not even done our seed yet, so it's a fair bit of traction early in the game.
Great, thanks. So one of the things we've been talking about, one of the sort of tensions is between the fully distributed identification and then blockchain, which is sort of a permanent identification. How do you see those two interacting versus conflicting versus, blending? So Brett, start with you maybe.
Sure. One of the interesting things about identity is that it's not static. And so if you are tracking someone's identity as a part of some relationship between a business and a consumer, for example, and if you take a look at the latest regulations around Banking Secrecy Act, they want you to be continuously identifying the customer and verifying that they are who they say they are and that they're not on the terrorist watch list and that kind of thing. So as you start to take a look at that, you have a need to keep a ledger that's ideally, blockchain works well as an immutable ledger to do that, to keep track of their identity and the attributes and how they change over time. At the same time, there's that's not the most the easiest thing to use to sort of distribute information. I mean, it creates an immutable record, but you have to decide how you're going to make the information available for the interaction between, let's say, a consumer and a business. So one of the things that the approaches that we've taken is to store the information that the user is going to use on a regular basis in their interactions out in their own environments, to essentially have a distributed database in addition to the ledger. And that distributed database ends up being the place that you might, let's say, bring algorithms to if you want to do privacy-preserving AI, instead of bringing the data to a centralized database that you're going to act on, for example. It's the place where when a business, for example, needs information about the consumer's identity or some piece of data, credit information, bank account information, whatever, they can choose to share it for that moment in time for that purpose. And depending on how you're interacting with the business, you can actually share the information, or you can just share proof that the information's true, or that the balance is greater than a certain amount, or that a payment's happened. So there's a lot of control you can provide, whereas today we tend to be, I use the term promiscuous, but we tend to just blow our data all over the place, and it's in the big data lake, it's in data ponds, as we were talking about earlier, all over the place, and you just completely lose control of it. And you wake up one day and it showed up in an Experian hack or something, and you didn't even know that Experian had it, or Axiom, or all these other data aggregators out there.
And I think that design isn't really, this shouldn't really be seen as kind of novel itself, it's the application. So like 90% of payments that are currently processed are done so with what's called an HSM. Typically, there's only 2 FIPS 3 compliant HSM manufacturers. There's Gemalto and Thales. And so the sharding of keys and the encryption of them is already being used today. It's just the application on-chain that is the novel idea.
And I just going and talking to just regular software companies, what I've been blown away with is over the last 2 years, I think that the explosion in development in blockchain showed software companies that there were demand for certain of these features that they didn't have in their own software. So there are certain things, for instance, Leaf, they need to put the money in the Stellar blockchain because they can't wire it to the new country because they haven't been allowed in the new country. They don't have a new bank account. So there's no way to do it today without blockchain. It might be possible with Journey in the future, but today it has to be with blockchain. But there's a lot of other things where Amazon offers services around Amazon Web Services, around provenance. Salesforce just came out with this idea of one single source of truth on your customer. So, we start to see that. We saw these privacy coins, Monero, ZK Snarks. These are all around zero knowledge proofs and being able to act and transact while you're kind of like put in a group with others, so nobody can tell specifically what you're doing or what they're doing. And a lot of these things have then been innovated back into the software space and resulting in something like a zero-knowledge network. So I do find it just fascinating to kind of watch the industry respond and really look at what needs to be on-chain versus what can get executed in enterprise software.
John, did you have
Excuse me. I was just going to say, I think one of the more interesting things is how a regulator is going to respond from my limited view, not technology-based. Excuse me, because really you have the data brokers out there that are buying and selling chunks of consumer data all day long, right? And they're wholly unregulated. I mean, if you're a fair credit reporting agent, if you're a credit bureau, you have pretty heavy regulation. If you are a financial institution, you have very heavy regulation. But we have these institutions out there that are buying and selling, thousands of consumers' data on a daily basis, and it's completely unregulated. And I think it's one of the failures of the U.S. banking system and the regulation. The regulators you can name them all, but for not amending a law, maybe it's the FCRA, maybe it's another law, to actually regulate that activity, because really it's not about, it's about the security of the data, as you all have pointed out, and not so much about, what technology do we use to make it easier, because obviously these are amazing solutions and we're doing that. But as an industry, I think for people who deal in consumer data, they should probably be regulated, because we've seen so many problems.
I think he's absolutely right. The regulators haven't given any guidance at all on privacy tokens, and that can be really problematic for, like she said, Zcash, Monero. A lot of them obfuscate who the sender and the recipient is, and regulators typically don't like that because that could be used for money laundering. And so instead of kind of addressing it head on, it's been used, and people are kind of waiting to see if they get their wrist slapped or not, which is probably not the best way to do things.
That's absolutely correct.
We actually had a really interesting experience with a number of the regulators as we were building out our architecture for our zero-knowledge identity network. And we met with FinCEN and FINRA, the Office of the Comptroller of the Currency, Federal Reserve. And a common theme with all these meetings when we'd go to DC is we would get a meeting with, we thought, 2 people, and we'd end up in a room with 30 people in the room. And the Federal Reserve meeting was particularly interesting because they did a roll call of every Federal Reserve office in the country that had a team of people on the phone for this meeting. And what we discovered was they were fascinated with this concept that we were trying to solve for GDPR on the one hand and Banking Secrecy Act on the other, because they always thought of those as mutually exclusive. Because of course with Banking Secrecy Act, you're supposed to keep all this customer data until 5 years after they cease to be a customer. And GDPR says, hey, I have the right to be forgotten, and I want to take my information back and take it with me. And so the approach that we came up with technologically basically solved for both of those at the same time. And the regulators were very, very interested. But it's interesting that they're difficult to collaborate with, I would say. So one of these meetings with the 30 people in the room, everybody asked all these really in-depth questions. It was kind of a fascinating, very interactive discussion. But at the end of it, I said, so what do you think? And this attorney in the front row looked at me and said, well, we can't answer that question. So, I mean, in the hallway, we got some feedback afterwards, and you could tell from the questions that were asked. But essentially, they're not designed to collaborate with anybody to try to figure out how to solve these problems. And we see that with the AML and Banking Secrecy Act rules. Here's what the problem is, but you figure out how you're going to solve it. We'll tell you if it's good enough.
And so going into the figuring out how to solve it, what are the challenges that you see for adoptions of these? Obviously, regulatory is part of it. What are the challenges you see for adoption of these various technologies in structured finance?
So I think one of the things that's interesting is you see a lot of things out there on self-sovereign identity today, and the idea that...
Did we define it?
I don't know that we did. You're actually probably one of the best to do that. Why don't you?
So the idea of self-sovereign identity is kind of the opposite of Facebook and giving out all of your data and telling people where you are every minute. It is actually having control of your own data. So imagine that the way that it's been most simply described is that imagine that all of your data, your healthcare data, your social security number, everything is on your phone, and then you can just, if you want to go to a bar, instead of showing someone all your data, you can just unlock the lock to prove that you know the combination and therefore you're above 21. And so it gives consumers absolute control over their data. One of the questions I have is what if someone hacks into your phone? But that's a different issue. But self-sovereign data is just the idea that you are the owner of your own data, and you should be the owner of your own data.
And nobody has hacked it's called the data enclave of like Android or iOS yet. So typically, so it is pretty secure even though it's on your phone.
I mean, one of the interesting challenges, though, with self-sovereign identity is there's a couple. One is that once I give the information that's on my phone to someone, your example of the bar and proving you're over 21 is great, but if you're doing business with a bank or insurance company or something, and they want your identity information to
They want to see my driver's license.
Yeah, to bind the whatever the insurance is or something, you're going to give them permission to have a copy of your data, and once you've done that, you've sort of lost control over what's going to happen to it from there. The other issue that you can run into is that for those businesses to be able to have the technology to receive that information from you or use those proofs that you might have on your phone, you have to have enough people using the same self-sovereign identity wallet, if you will, to be able to provide that information so that a large enterprise says, yes, I'm going to support that and I want to do business with it. One of the things that we have done, we sort of came at it the other direction and we said, well, if we come up with an approach that solves these problems for a large bank, a large insurance company, a large enterprise of any kind, they might have 100 million users. And so if we go solve it for that bank and it's cost effective and it solves a real problem for them, the technology is going to end up in that enterprise's mobile app. The user's just going to be using it without even sort of thinking about it because it builds up out of their interactions they do every day. And then one of the interesting things about GDPR is in the long run, we could actually go the other direction because with privacy rules like GDPR, you have the right to take your information with you. Well, if we exist in a bunch of large enterprise business applications in this environment and it's sort of been built, the technology's been built that way, there's no reason you couldn't then have a self-sovereign identity app and basically populate it with the information that you pull back from all the companies you're doing business with that are using it. So we sort of came at it from that direction as a way to sort of practically grow it by being able to convince one enterprise at a time that we're solving a real problem for them.
And that's much easier. There was a couple of projects that were talking about getting all of your healthcare data, back, that it's all your property and from all the different hospitals and the different things, so you can really run analytics and tell how you're doing over time. And if you have different doctors in different hospitals, it's really hard to do that. And what they found was that each individual consumer, as much as that's an attractive endpoint for them, does not want to spend weeks on the phone with all these different doctors' offices and hospitals, getting faxes in and then digitizing it to make that a reality. And then you multiply that by millions of people, and there was just such complacency to get it done, even though they want the end result. So it's a great way to kind of backdoor into that.
Thanks. So just as we're wrapping up, a little bit of prediction. Where do you think we will be in this industry on implementing these technologies in, let's say, 5 years? I would say if we had this panel next year, where would we be with it? But it may be that we'll be saying the same thing next year. But 5 years out.
So in a hypothetical, perfect, beautiful world, I would only have to do my KYC and AML once, and then that could be distributed with zero knowledge. So every year I would have to do it again, but I only have to do it once. This is also true for our platform. So we have banking partners, payment partners, the tokenized money market fund we're doing. Every single one of those integrations requires KYC and AML. And so for the consumer, obviously we're not going to ask them to do that 5 times just because we have 5 integrations. And so 5 years out, I do think that technology like Journey.ai will be ubiquitous.
And I'm coming at it from a little different angle. 5 years out, these data lakes are going to be at great risk because quantum computing is being used today, and it sounds like it's a big thing, but but you can actually rent quantum time on the cloud today. And I believe over the next 5 years, quantum is real as an accelerator, the same way you would use a graphics processor as an accelerator to your main processor in your computer. And quantum can unlock most cryptography today. And so how are people going to really secure those lakes going forward over the next 5 years? I think it becomes more and more critical that you have some kind of distributed, hashed network that is quantum secure.
I think I think about it in terms of the fact that we're going to really need to get to a point where we've got trusted customer relationships again between businesses and consumers. And that's sort of at the root of all these things. And to get to that trusted relationship, on the one hand, you're going to want to know that people are who they say they are. You've got to verify their identity. You're going to want to be able to care for that information in a privacy-preserving manner, and the consumer is going to want to believe that that's actually going to happen. And on the business side, people are going to start to realize that that's a requirement that all the consumers they do business with are starting with. So they're going to have to figure out how to build that in and yet still be able to do the personalization, meet all the regulatory requirements and all the other things that they need to do. And I think, as we talked about with some of the ROI conversations as well, there's going to be a huge return for business if they figure out how to do this, where they can simultaneously approach privacy, security, and the customer experience, because they'll take a lot of the friction out of it and they'll take a lot of the fraud out of it. So they're going to end up with better customer transactions, relationships. They're going to get rid of a lot of that fraud and friction that's associated with it. So there's going to be a lot of business reasons to go after it. Austin shared a conversation with me earlier today with one of the funds that you're involved with, where there was an enormous difference in the return in one where you basically could look at that information versus the one where you can't.
Yeah, so if you look at the different platforms, some of them publish, they distill the data down and scrub it at PII, but they also have all of the credit bureau data. And when I was, for example, when I was at a company called Prosper, I built the data strategy there, and we would get about 1,200 credit bureau facts back from Equifax and Experian for any loan on a retail loan. We would share about 150 to 240 of those credit bureau facts with investors to build their confidence that they're in the asset that they're buying. Once we started doing machine learning on that, the quantitative hedge fund that I founded or co-founded focused purely on kind of bespoke nascent credit, and the returns are about 13% right now, and that's a Franklin fund now. Versus passive selection, where that data doesn't exist, only returns about 3%. So we've seen a 900 BIP to 1,000 BIP increase in performance when you actually use the credit bureau data to re-rate and to price risk.
Makes the problem we're solving.
Yes. And John, any thoughts on where the regulators think?
I mean, excuse me, I'm bullish on the technology. I never bet against the technology. Just from a dumb lawyer perspective, I mean, I think the more interesting thing for me, at least from my seat, is that how the big banks react. I mean, we're talking about the largest consumer credit market in the world, the residential mortgage market in the U.S., the banks are unwilling participants in it. I mean, to be fair, they're doing it only because they feel they have to, because they've been through hell and they feel like, we have to have a sticky relationship with the consumer. But, what is fintech? And everyone throws that around, but how that works, and we're talking about non-depository institutions with no balance sheet, no equity, often, a lot of them, and they are going to be tasked with solving this financial need in the U.S. and that tension is really interesting to me.
Great. Thank you, and thank you everybody for joining us. If you have any questions, we will be around for a little bit after the session. So thank you, and enjoy the remaining hour of the conference.